So our final panelist tonight is Antonin Baudry, who's the cultural counselor for the French Embassy in the U.S. And although we're very fortunate that he's headquartered here in New York, he actually has responsibility for all of the United States in terms of cultural affairs and higher education. And as he's also the permanent representative of French universities in the U.S. Before taking up his position here last fall, Antonin was the cultural counselor in Spain for 4 years, and before that he held a number of government positions, including conseiller technique in the cabinet of Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin, where he was in charge of international cultural and economic affairs and francophonie. Before he began his career in public service, Antonin had an interesting and unusual trajectory as a student. He started out as a brilliant young mathematician and a student of engineering at the École Polytechnique, but he decided to change and follow his passion and study literature at the École Normale Supérieure, where he worked on a thesis on Proust under the direction of Antoine Compagnon. So we will now hear from Antonin Baudry. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Shani. And I'm sorry I was late. I just flew in from Paris. My arm's tired. I'm very impressed by the quality of the panelists here, so I'm sure my work will be very easy because they have said everything and much better than I ever would. So I will just make a few personal remarks and tell them what are my convictions. I think that if French matters, it's simply because it is a global language. It's not only a local European language. French is a dynamic world language, as we can see from the recent winners, for example, of the Prix Goncourt, which is one of the most prestigious French literary prizes. Atik Raimi or Jonathan Little, for example, have different mother tongues, and they choose to write in French, as did Samuel Beckett before them. And French is still on the rise, I think, as we can see in recent political events. The way France has taken the leadership in North Africa or Middle East, for example, thanks to its deep historical and linguistic ties in this region. I think we can say that a lot of events taking place right now in the world are taking place in French. I think that even events have a mother tongue in this sense. In the 21st century, France is being transformed from within by Francophone writers, from its immigrants, from each foreigner who comes in France and who transforms French. Like, for example, Marie Ndiaye, who's a very famous French writer living in Berlin, but his father came from Senegal, and it's just an example among 1,000. So I think that there is a real dialectical relationship between France and the world. It's on both sides. I mean, it's a dynamic exchange. It's not just France imposing culture and language on its former colonies. I think it's these former colonies who enrich the French language and the French culture. And I would like to show you an article from The Guardian, the UK Guardian, which is not casual. The title is "French is too important to be left to middle-class Francophiles." And I love the Brits, just because of this. And André Housset, who wrote this article, I don't know him, but he says he's not especially a Francophone or a Francophile, but he gives us a very simple reason for that. And he says, I'm quoting him, "Writing in French from Morocco to Senegal to Quebec has much to teach us in Britain about the hyper-complexity of the post-colonial world." And I think it's remarkable that the Guardian could publish this argument about French. I think that I believe that in order to understand the world as it is today, you have to speak or French or Spanish or other languages, or at least you have to know people who do so. And English is a global language, of course, but it does not mean that events take place in English all around the world. I think that if French is a global language, this is not only because of political events or geopolitics, the facts I was mentioning before. But I think it's also because of more fundamental reasons. France and America share a common heritage, and of course this has to be with the connection with the Enlightenment values. And I saw that Bill Clinton said in 1995 in a lecture at Georgetown University, he said that America is an idea. And of course then it developed, and he said that this idea was freedom, and that the shape of America was the kind of consequence of idea. And I think that we could say the same about France. I think that France is an idea too. It would not be the same. Maybe it would have to see more with equality than freedom, or maybe something more complex than I could say tonight. But I think that the whole structure of the country and all the relationships between the people can be understood as consequences of ideas, as for example the importance of the state in France, or many other things that, I mean actual things. And for that, I think that it makes French a very global language, as English is. And something more maybe is that you probably saw that foreign affairs are very important in France. I think that a lot of foreigners in France are struck by the importance in the daily newspapers of foreign affair articles or and pages. And everybody in France has an idea about political affairs. I mean, sometimes it's a very simple idea, it's not very sophisticated and everything, but it's part of the mental landscape of a French regular citizen. And it means that somehow French language integrates a part of the world. Maybe it's not a perfect way, of course, but there is a part of that. And if French language integrates the outside world, that means that French is a global and coherent system, and I dare say a point of view on the world in a Leibnizian sense. Leibniz had the idea that every being was kind of a point of view on the world, and of course some have broader than others. Of course a human being will have a broader point of view on the world than a tiger, for example, but every being has one. And I think that French is the global perspective on the world and on history. So these two countries, France and America, are two global perspectives on the world, and I think that therefore they have a lot to share on international affairs and on every subject for fundamental reasons and not only for accidental reasons. If people talk English all around the world, it does not mean that people think in English all around the world, and we can communicate in English, but I think we cannot insert ourselves into another worldview without a second language. And even if words are translatable, and they are not always, by the way, but thoughts and worldviews are not in the words. They exist in the blanks or in the spaces between words. And these blanks and these spaces between words are not translatable. I mean, it's the difference between Google and a human soul, for example. And Google will never translate the blank and the blanks and the spaces between words. And that's just why I think Google translation just doesn't work. These blanks and these spaces between words are the system or are the structure that assemble the interpretation of the words, in the same sense that you talk of an interpretation of a music sheet, for example. And in other words, you cannot get the sense of some reality without the language that encloses it. I could quote Walter Benjamin in The Task of the Translator, quoting Nietzsche, the closer we look at a word, the further it looks back at us from. I think that the experience of a second language is like music. It is another dimension, open throughout your life, and nothing can replace it if you don't have it. Because when you learn a second language, you have a whole new worldview. And Chateaubriand said, to have a second language is to have a second soul. And I think that for the reasons I said before, French is a spacious soul. I don't say that it's a comfortable soul, for example. I don't say that it's an optimistic soul. And maybe you saw a survey in France that proved that French people were more pessimistic than the Afghan people, for example. But it is, I think it is still an interesting second soul. So more concretely, what is the situation now in the US? Of course, we all heard and we all had many concerns about the situations, especially, for example, in Albany. And yeah, the initial plan was to deactivate or dismantle the whole French department there. And I went there and told to his President Philippe of Sonny Albany, and he explained that the reasons were among all, more than everything else, financial, because of the budget cuts and everything you already know. And we proposed to try and enhance the number, to try and help enhancing number of French students there, because it's always a key for the protection of French departments. And we learned, as I'm sure you learned too, a few days ago, that finally they will keep the minors in French. They will not keep the majors in French, unfortunately. This is the bad point, but the good point is that they keep the minor, and therefore there will still be a French department. So we take that as a starting point, and from this point we will try to help this department to increase the number of French students. So this is an example, maybe an iconic example, but the situation is kind of a paradox here, because there is an increasing of the number of students who are studying French in the US. This increasing is 5% this year, and in the same time there is a big increasing of collaborations between French and American universities in all disciplines, from French literature to nanotechnologies or history and biology, even at the highest level. We are talking about a lot of dual degrees and even dual PhDs. 7,000 articles have been co-written and co-signed by French and American scholars. So the situation of collaborations between French and American universities is rather good, and we have a lot of instruments helping this increasing as a PUF, but we can talk of that later, maybe in the questions. And at the same time, there is a threat on many French departments in the US because of budget cuts. And when I see this kind of threats, I mean, I don't take that personally, because it's not only French. I mean, it's also Italian, and it's all languages except for Spanish, which is not exactly a foreign language, or Chinese for other reasons. And it's not only languages; it's also humanities that somehow are threatened in the U.S. universities. So we don't take it personally, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to do, we don't have to react. And I heard many people asking if it was important in this context to keep French departments and French studies in the universities, and people are doing that as there are many collaborations in sciences and everything. It might prove that we don't need it. And I think that we really need it. And I mean, what would be an important university in the US without mathematicians? Well, would it be possible to have very high-level research in physics or economics or biology without any math department? It wouldn't. And I think that it is because math is a language, is the language of sciences. And I think that it's the common point between French and math. They are both languages. French is not only the people that the language that people are talking in the streets of Paris. It's a language, but it's also a language for history, philosophy, ethnology, literature, etc., etc. And of course, I don't pretend that every ethnologist would have to speak French, of course. But I think that it is important that some of them do, and that they could talk of literature and history and ethnology in French and with their colleagues. I think that French studies enrich all disciplines. It's not an isolated field of learning. And I think that the French department of Columbia is really the perfect example of this. Here, I understood that every French scholar, every French teacher was also involved in another department of Columbia University. It could be history or ethnology and so and so. And it's, of course, very clever and very important to do so, because it protects French department and it shows the deepest links there are between French studies and the other disciplines. We will, in the French embassy, we will of course encourage every French department in the US to forge this kind of links, because these links give value to French departments and protect them. Interdisciplinarity centers and of French and Francophone studies will be, for example, encouraged. You know that we subsidize 15 interdisciplinary centers in the US, and each time it's it's at least 2 departments deciding to create a French programs together, and it means that it involves always more than the French department. And I think that it could be useful to think of it as a protection or a tool to foster French departments in the US. But of course, there are many different situations in the US, in the French departments, and innovating solutions are being proposed throughout the US. I was recently at Yale, for example, and at Yale they are thinking of creating a new kind of PhD. I won't enter the details now, but there are a lot of different solutions that are proposed. And that's why I would like to create a task force composed by influential friends of French culture and of innovative leaders of French departments to imagine together the university of the future and the place of French within it. No discipline exists in isolation, and no language exists in isolation. The French language today is an expensive global language. It's a window on a global world. Thank you very much.